Hey, Three Crosses family, welcome back to the podcast. Pastor AJ here, and we are near the tail end of the Revelation series. We are looking at Revelation chapter 17 all the way to chapter 18 today. We're taking a peek behind the curtain to see the throne of evil. We have a fascinating conversation in store for you, and with that, let's go deeper. Joining us to talk about Revelation chapter 17 through 18, Pastor Danny. Pastor Danny, we are pretty close to the end here. We're getting there. We're so close.
We're in the home stretch. We got this section, then we got 19 and 20 next week, then 21, 22, and then we are in Advent. Christmas time is here, so it's been great.
Yeah, we got a pretty thought-provoking section going on, especially the week after an election, and it's very fascinating conversation to have. So we're gonna hop right in, but first I'm gonna ask about context before we jump into too much of the content. So let me read the first couple verses here. Chapter 17, verse 1. Here we go. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." At face value, I see a couple things here. I see language of the seven bowls, so it's kind of a continuation of what's going on from last week's conversation in chapters 15 and 16. And so we have one of the angels that was holding one of the seven bowls saying, "Come, I will show you this great prostitute." And so I see a lot of prostitution, adultery language. Help us navigate where we've gone up to this point so far in this series, and what do you think's beginning to be birthed out of this scene right here?
Yeah, the kind of the main lineage or timeline of our series so far has been following all the sevens of the judgment on God's earth and the wrath that he brings. And so we started in the throne room with a big scroll. Jesus opens the seven seals. Then we have the seven trumpets. Then we have the seven bowls. And so we've kind of followed this season of sevens as we've watched the judgment come on planet Earth. So on one hand, this is a continuation of that. Now we're talking about the fall of Babylon. On the other side of the bowl judgment, now we're, especially the next chapter here, chapter 18 and then 19, we are kind of hearing the lament of the fall of Babylon and the praise in the beginning of the next chapter of God's people towards what Christ is doing. But at the same time, we almost have a B side of the story too. If you remember chapter 12, we kind of took a break from all those sevens and we got this fantastic image of a dragon and a woman and this whole cosmic story. And in many ways, it feels like this is the continuation of that story. So that story kind of ended and moved us into the bowls. Now we move out of the bowls, and now we're meeting another kind of that beast again from that same story, and another woman. And it seems like a cartoonish story that's different than the 777s we followed so far. So a bit of a shift, but at the same time, a continuance of the narrative.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put cartoonish, right? That it seems like what we're given is a description of something. And, before we get too deep into the weeds of what this image paints, we already see the language of adultery happening. But one of the styles of writing in the first century that was known is called ekphrasis, which literally means a detailed description of something. And so a lot of times it would be a description of a work of art. And so it feels like what's happened, we've seen a lot of sequence movements with the sevens. We've seen a lot of history. We've talked a lot about these moving parts that are culminating at the seven bowls. And then for some reason we get this like pause scene, like we just get to see something. And what's fascinating is this vision is probably the one that gets described the most and gets explained. So it's like, it feels like this pause is making us think about something. And the first clues that we get are prostitution and adultery. What kind of language does that have to play into what's going on here?
Yeah, prostitution and adultery, we normally naturally think of the act of adultery or the vocation of prostitution or the act of prostitution. In the scripture, these are terms and phrases that are used in symbolic literature like this, a lot of times to talk about the spiritual state of people's souls. And so, for example, in the Old Testament, there's a whole book devoted to the book of Hosea that talks about the fact that God's people are supposed to be faithful to him as he's been faithful to them, like a bride-husband relationship. But we've gone out and prostituted ourselves with all of these other gods and with all of these other things. And so this idea of kind of wandering from God and uniting ourselves with false gods, things that have these promises for us, things that we think are going to give us contentment or joy. A lot of times that's described as prostitution. So as we see this panned out, we don't see literal children being born as prostitution acts are happening. What we do see is these kings of the earth coming to this prostitute and kind of engaging in all of this perverse action. And almost what is born out of that is just a culture of grossness, a culture of sin that permeates the entire Roman Empire. So really kind of we have to look at this at a spiritual level, that this is supposed to be a peek behind the curtain of kind of the way that Satan has cooperated with the beast of the empire to birth sin into the world by enticing world leaders to step into this system in which God does not reign.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of Old Testament imagery of prostitution as well. Isaiah 23 talking about the city of Tyre, which will become important later. O forgotten prostitute, make sweet melody, sing many songs that you may be remembered. Prostituted herself with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth, talking about the destruction of Tyre. But it also gets described as Israel a lot. Ezekiel 16, which is, if you've never read that passage, this might be the time to read that passage. Ezekiel 16, you trusted in your beauty and played the whore because of your renown and lavished your whorings on any passerby. Just extremely, extremely strong language to capture this imagery of something alluring and attaching yourself, unifying with something like that. So I just think that imagery right off the bat is so powerful. And like I said, it's like almost a snapshot, and we're given the description of the snapshot starting in verse 3. The angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. Like you were saying, we've seen this wilderness motif playing out now. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand, filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. This is the description we get. There's a lot of things going on here. Scarlet beast. We have the woman sitting on the beast, dressed in all sorts of things. We have this mysterious name. What exactly stands out to you about the imagery going on right here, about this snapshot that we're seeing?
Now, the first thing that comes out to me as I read this passage is it reminds me of Revelation chapter 12, that story of the woman and the dragon, because at the end of that story, it says that when the dragon went after the woman, it couldn't find her because she was hidden, and that they hid her in the wilderness where she could be kept safe from the dragon.
Right.
And then this story begins, and he says, hey, come out to the wilderness. I want to show you a woman. And then we see this woman. And then my first thought was, oh no, like, is this the same woman?
Didn't really keep her safe.
Yeah.
Right?
Did she like turn to the dark side or something? And now she has gone into this act of perversion. But deeper research shows that, no, this woman is not the mother of the church. This woman is the mother, in a sense, of all the nations of the world, of Babylon, of the Roman Empire. And so these are 2 different women. So I thought, this is confusing. Why are there 2 women that one brings just joy and life, and the other one brings death? And it reminded me of Proverbs chapter 9. Proverbs, if you've read the book, is a book of wise sayings of how to live wisely. And in chapter 9, there is a story of 2 different women who both exist on the highest points in town. One is Lady Wisdom and one is Lady Folly. And they have very similar lines, right? The Lady Wisdom invites people, passers-by, coming up to my house, come and dine here, come and eat the food of wisdom. And then Lady Folly is doing the same thing, but she's inviting them to a life of foolishness. Come, and she says stuff that's a little more alluring. Stolen water tastes sweet. Food eaten in secret tastes delicious. And then it has this menacing line. It says, but little do they know that the dead are there, that in her house are the dead. And so we get this picture that these women both exist in the same place. One is simply calling out, come and find life in this place. The other one is calling out, hey, come and find life in this place. But with this allure, with this secrecy, with the kind of the lure of sinfulness. And then she devours these people who come to her. And so when I read this story, that's the first thing I think of is she looks a lot like that Lady Folly who was enticing the kings and people of the earth to come and dine with her, so to speak, to sleep with her, so to speak. And really what she's luring them into is a trap, a place where she's drinking blood, she's creating martyrs, but she's also creating grossness in the systems of this world. And so, yeah, that's the first thing I think of is, okay, this woman looks a lot like Lady Folly. The second thing I think of when I read this is it sounds like the story of Jabba the Hutt in Star Wars, because I feel like as I look at this story, it's supposed to, on one hand, look decadent, and on the other hand, be just disgusting. And I'll get something about this Star Wars story wrong, so sorry about this. But I picture in my mind, right, they're going to rescue Leia, who's a prisoner of Jabba the Hutt. And if you remember the story, you go inside Jabba's palace. He's got this big palace, all this money, these attendants, kind of the gold, the pillows, lounging. He's living a life of ease and luxury. But he's a disgusting being. He's designed to look disgusting to us. Leia is some sort of slave to him. She's on a chain, right? She's dressed a certain way. And it just feels like, okay, this whole thing is supposed to be like decadent and luxury and riches, but it's just gross and perverse and icky. And that's the image that I get when I see this woman. She's in the woods, in the wilderness. She is reclining on this beast, kind of like the never-ending story or something, right? She's like riding this beast, but this beast has 7 heads. We find out later these are the 7 hills, most likely the 7 hills of Rome. And you get this picture of like inside the belly of the beast, behind the curtain, right, is this woman who seems to be like the hive, the source of everything gross in the world. And she's somehow riding the Roman Empire. Maybe she represents the city of Rome itself. And we've learned from Revelation 12 and 13 that this beast is in cooperation with Satan himself. And so it's like, oh my gosh, this is the source of everything bad and evil in the world. It's supposed to be, like I said on Sunday, it's supposed to be disturbing.
Yeah, I think that Proverbs analogy is so deep as well, because underneath like wisdom and folly, it's almost described as a woman, like enticing. Because I know Lady Wisdom is saying like, come, like I'll give you those treasures in the same way. Lady Folly is saying the same thing. So like underneath wisdom and folly are enticing things, right? So I think that's super fascinating.
Not just the part of that's the prostitution language, it's enticing,
right?
But I think part of the reason that prostitution is used in the scripture to describe this in a negative way, and that women are used in both of these in the scriptures, is just the idea that the women are the humans who are designed by God to bring forth life into the world by carrying children into the world. And when Jesus talks about all the good that comes out of our relationship with him, he describes it as fruit, right? It's like the fruit of a fruitful womb. And when we hear about all the evil in the world, it's almost like giving birth to all of this terrible things, right? And so this picture of like birth and giving birth, and that birth comes through consummating a relationship with this person, this idea of you unite yourself with wisdom and there's this fruit of wisdom, or you unite yourself with a prostitute and there's this fruit of sinfulness, the deeds of the flesh, right? So whether that's Galatians or that's John 15 or that's Proverbs 9, or that's the divine mandate in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see this picture that the reason these things are embodied as a woman is because of their life-generating capability, and that when we consummate relationship with them, life is born, whether it's evil or good, something new is birthed into the world. And so even this woman, the phrase on her forehead says the mother of prostitutes, right? So she's not merely creating sin, she's creating a system of sin that people like her are being created, which is a symbol to say that she's poisoning all the systems of the world in the same way that the judgments of God in the last chapter poisoned all the water sources of the world.
Now, I know we could dive in and pick apart like all of these different imageries, and we could be here for a long time. But we've talked about the beast with 7 heads, 10 horns. Presumably it's the same beast that we read about. We could talk about purple and scarlet and the imagery of gold, precious stones, and pearls, which I think we'll get to in chapter 18. But the one thing that we came across in studying this was a particular image. Yeah. So one of the things that showed up on one of my commentaries was this Cistercius of Vespasian. And so Vespasian was a Roman emperor. This was a coin, almost like a nickel, but it was a coin that was circulated around AD 71, so around the time of what was happening. And if you Google it, which I would encourage you to do, just like we told you to Google some of the other images, you're going to see this person sitting on 7 different hills with a small sword in her left hand, and she's got her feet on something that looks like the river god Tiber of the time. So the feet on the waters, which is according to this. And we have on the left a miniature she-wolf is supposedly what it is. And Romulus and Remus suckling it's located at the lower left. And that word she-wolf is lupa in the original language, and it can also mean prostitute.
Really?
So my question is, with that in mind, considering that there might have been like a Roman coin in circulation that eerily matches the description of what's happening here, how might that affect the way you approach this text in particular? Because it's like grabbing at some of the images that are already familiar.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the woman who's depicted on that coin is the goddess Roma, which the city of Rome is named after. She's seated on the 7 hills of Rome. And there's other coins that have her image on it. And there's a lot, you can see architecture today that has her image on it. She was seen as almost the one who brought forth domination, violence, military power into the world. A lot of times she's on a horse, she's got a sword, right? There's this idea of like the Roman Empire. It's a culture of violence, a culture of appeasing the gods through violence and bloodshed. We can talk about that today or some other time. But in this one image, she's in a different pose. She's reclining on the hills of Rome. I think in the imagery in this one and maybe some other ones that she's doing this, right? There's one of her breasts is bared, which is the symbol of nursing offspring. Like there's this motherly figure that not only is this warrior that brings bloodshed, but she also is kind of the mother of the nation, kind of like the source of all that's coming out here. And so, yeah, I would imagine you read this and you're like, oh my gosh, she's described, like, it's like describing, I don't know, it's like some iconic image from American culture, but making it look really perverse. I think of like, horror, like cartoons or something where it's like the Washington crossing the Delaware, but his face is melting or something. And it's supposed to mean something, right? And so as we see the empire is falling, Babylon is falling, we're getting a glimpse, right? Even in this passage, it says, I'm going to tell you what this means. These 7 heads are the 7 hills, like, of Rome. Yeah. So he's unmasking the beast to say, hey, when I say that Satan rises up world empires to carry out his bidding, I'm talking about the empire we live in today. And if we turn back the curtain and we go to the heart of that empire, Rome, we will see that Satan has completely turned this thing disgusting, and everything bad in this world is pouring out of this city, and this Babylon is about to be destroyed, and this is why we're going to rejoice.
I can almost imagine people reading this and being like, man, it was right in front of us the whole time. Just like all I got to do is take out like this coin and then I see it, and just to bring that to life. And I think it does solidify the idea that like what we're seeing in this text is like this static image that people are supposed to look at and understand and interpret, because that was one of the ways that they wrote in the first century, was like, hey, I'm going to describe this painting. It might have some significant meanings. It might be secret. But the cool thing about this chapter is that we finally, out of all the crazy imagery, it feels like we get a description of what these are supposed to mean.
Like, wow, it's Rome.
Which is really refreshing. So here's the reaction that the author says in verse 6. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. The angel said to me, why are you astonished? I'll explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast, which you saw, once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. So let's stop there. We hit the beast, we hit the inhabitants of the earth, and this common refrain here, once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss. What do you think's going on in this particular description of the beast and the inhabitants of the earth that succumb to the beast, that are astonished by him?
Yeah, I think one thing we need to point out is, on one hand, we're saying, it's Rome. And most commentators say, he's talking about Babylon, he's talking about Rome. That doesn't necessarily mean that we believe that everything in Revelation has already happened. That,
Right.
oh, the bowl judgment, that was just on Israel or something. That's not, all that stuff has already taken place. Right? Commentators all agree this is Rome, but they are still split on, are the events of Revelation supposed to predict something in the future, this cosmic sky melting judgment, or did that all happen in the past, right? And so the reason that we say, hey, this is Rome, is we get this image that John is opening his eyes to, wow, it's the systems of this world that are tainted by Satan, which if we take a futurist view of Revelation, we still say that today. Wow, the systems of the world are tainted by Satan. You could also say, hey, and then once the Roman Empire fell, the kingdom began, right? But then there's some hardship in that because the world has not been perfect for the last, 1,500 years or whatever. And so that's the first thing, is that on one hand, this is Rome. On the other hand, this doesn't mean that we have to read everything in the book of Revelation through the lens of like, oh, that's all stuff that happened in the first century. It still applies to us. But yeah, looking at this image, I see kind of this iterative, this refrain that goes over again. It was, and then it wasn't, and then it will be again. On one hand, it's a reversal of the description of God from most of the Bible, who was and is to come, kind of the consistency of God and God's plans. On the other hand, we saw in chapter 12, this beast rises from the sea. And so, and then again, it's going to rise from the abyss. We'll see that next week, I think. But there's this bit of an iteration that this beast rears its ugly head and then kind of dies down, then rears its ugly head and then dies down. And it's interesting, if you're mapping on kind of the Christian experience past the first century into the second and third centuries, that is what it would have felt like to live in the Roman Empire under the reigns of these various emperors throughout the days, right? There were some who reigned, they all believed in the gods of Rome, and they all believed until Confucius, until Constantine, they all agreed in the gods of Rome, but some would come in and there'd be tyrannical leaders who would say, if you don't worship the gods of Rome, you're out of here. And so these waves of persecution would come where at different levels of gravity, where the empire would turn against Christians and they'd start shedding their bloods, gladiatorial games, lighting them on fire, extinguish them methodically, sending militaries into their villages, slaughtering gatherings of churches. And then another emperor would rise to power and say, you know what, actually, the gods of Rome are the real gods, but we're going to be a more tolerant nation. And so you can worship your gods as long as you don't mess with society. And these waves of persecution would decrease. And then they'd come back again and then decrease again. And so I wonder if that's what he's getting at here, that they were, then they weren't, then they were again, is that was probably what it would feel like to be in the Roman Empire. That if you picture as a believer that Rome is this beast with steel teeth, like we saw in the Old Testament, out to devour you, when the wave of persecution ended, you would think, oh, the beast, maybe it's dead.
Yeah.
And then it would come back like, oh, no, it's coming back. Right? And then it's dead. And ultimately it will be dead and we'll know when it's dead. But in this time, and times and half a time, the beast is going to come and leave and come and leave. So that's what I first think when I read this. I'm sure there's commentators who've got a much better idea than that.
I think they're guessing as well. I mean, they're trying to figure it out. The mention of the healing of the head wound, I think that keeps coming up a lot, is like, it seems like, there is a death to the system, and then all of a sudden it rises up again.
I mean, you think of like whether it's Caesar is assassinated, it's like, this is it. Like, and then, some people think that's the head wound, right? But then another Caesar pops up in his place, like, no, it's not over yet, or Rome burns down, right? Well, Nero fiddles, Rome burns. He blames the Christians, and so persecution increases, but is Rome dying? And then it builds back up again. It's like, oh, it's back, And so you do see this iterative process. And you see throughout Rome, especially the way that Rome was ruled for most of this season until the 4th century, or maybe the late 3rd century, Rome was ruled as a community of Emperor Caesars all over the empire, who together kind of ruled Rome from all over the place. And so this beast with many heads, with many horns, really does describe the Roman Empire. It wasn't until Constantine, maybe he was the emperor before Constantine, but Constantine for sure, where it's okay, no, there's going to be one centralized ruler, one power source, and all the rest of the empire is going to bow to this one person. That doesn't happen until the 300s. Yeah,
it seems like too there was like a mystical belief too, because we've been talking about this Nero myth as well, of just Nero who was assassinated, and then there was this belief that he could come back from the dead. So like he was, and now he's not, and then perhaps he might be coming back from the abyss.
Which again, when it's like Nero's dead and then he comes back, it's like, hey, you know what? This doesn't mean he's the Christ. He's an antichrist. Like
Right.
he is.
It's a resurrection,
pretending
right?
It's a fake resurrection.
Yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition between that resurrection and the resurrection of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. One fun little bit of research here. There was a thing on epitaphs in the first century, and one of them was so funny, I had to put it in here. I was not. I was born. I was. I am not. So much for that.
I like that.
Just imagine that on your tombstone.
Yeah, that's.
But it seems very similar. Like there is an epitaph here. Like I'm not going to be, and yet I will come. So there's just a lot of interesting parallels from the one who is, who was, and who is to come, as a description of God. So the description of the portrait that we're getting continues in verse 9. This calls for a mind of wisdom. We've heard that phrase before. It's almost like a call. All right, pay attention. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain only for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. A lot going on in that passage. It's kind of a tongue twister. I had to read it a little bit slower.
This requires wisdom. I'm going to listen real carefully. And I'm getting lost real quick.
So we got 5 that have fallen. 1 that is. So presumably the
currently in
number
power?
6 is in power. Which
666
maybe.
That's the last time he said this. For calls for wisdom, his number is 6. maybe it's not his number is 666. Maybe he's like, its number is 6. 6. I'm going to say it one more time. 6. Is that possible?
Maybe.
Wow.
I mean,
but
you heard it here first.
The 6th is currently
so the one
in power.
who is, and then the one has yet to come. So now we're at 7. But when he does come, this 7th king must remain only for a little while. So the 7th king is going to reign for a little bit.
Is that Caesar? Huh? Caesar?
Potentially, but I don't think he's come yet. So maybe they're looking at the present and saying, hey, there's one more to come.
And he's going to be assassinated or something.
The beast who once was and now is not is the 8th king. And so we have this count of 8 different kings.
There's someone coming in the future.
There's somebody coming that is that 8th king.
And we're currently at 6.
We're currently at 6.
6,
I tell you.
6. Yeah, don't just go off and believe this because I've never heard a commentator say that. That's not what it means.
Neither.
Yeah.
But a lot of commentators have put a lot of pen to paper to try and figure out what kings are they talking about.
Okay.
So, Pastor Danny,
is this
any
I feel like
theories?
we're about to start like the music's going to start like, all right, now we're going to enter into a game show. Just kidding. I'm like, what is the king?
We just got to let you know that every time we play this podcast, we want to play that song.
I've been wanting to push that button for so long.
We have this control panel here, and we have a lot of buttons that we can push. So, for example,
well, I don't feel like you should ever do that one to me.
But Daniel have a.
So are we about to play the game show?
We're about to play the game show. Name the 8 kings that are yet to come.
I will not be able to answer any of those questions. So I'm hoping.
What do you think he's doing with the sequence here? That's basically the question.
There's a chance that he's really trying to help, kind of say, focus. We're on the 6th emperor now. Count it back. You'll know that I'm talking about the 6th emperor now. There's one more coming. He's going to die. And then after that one, the 8th one, watch that one because that one is going to actually lead to destruction. That's totally possible. I'm interested to see what your commentator said about who those people are.
I have a whole chart here.
Wow.
Because, I mean, from sermon number 1, if you remember in the podcast episode, this is like a key text that a lot of people have pointed to try and figure out when this thing is dated. And so you can kind of look at the kings and come up with some sort of list that kind of makes sense. And so there's a lot of theories. I have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different theories listed.
I want to point out that you're trying to do this in retrospect.
In retrospect.
And it's this complicated.
It is very complicated.
I can't imagine being in John's churches here and trying to do this in real time, talking about the future that hasn't existed yet.
Right.
Which
Thinking
is like us
like,
reading Revelation today, right?
Yeah. Think about I can barely even name the presidents. So like naming like 5 presidents backwards, I'm like, I don't know if I could do that. Yeah. I mean, I probably could if I really thought about it.
We're not going to play that game show either.
We're not going to play that game show either. A lot of people will start at Julius Caesar as like the beginning of Rome.
Or the first?
The first.
Okay.
So they'll start their count there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You end up with Claudius. You've covered over Gaius, which we mentioned. He's kind of the first emperor that has claimed deity. So he's kind of mixed in with one of those 5. So then 6 would be Nero. If you start at Julius Caesar, number 6, which now would be Nero in any of those lists. The seventh one could be Galba.
I've never heard of Galba.
You probably never heard of.
Short-lived.
Because Galba, the next three reign for like a couple, maybe less than 2 years. And so they're just here and then they're gone. They're here and then they're gone, which kind of aligns up because they reign for a short time. Mm-hmm. And so if you count those, you end up with a guy named Otho around AD 69, which leading up to 70 AD might be something there. Or a lot of people have skipped those three and said, hey, they don't really count because they were only here for so little.
Too short a time?
They were here for too short a time. And if you do that, number 7 is then Vespasian.
Okay.
And number 8 in that list, if you skip the 3, is Titus, who was the person.
Write a book in the Bible.
Not that Titus. No. This Titus he was a Roman authority not governor. He was a military advisor during the time of the destruction of the temple.
Okay.
And so that's a big one. That's just starting at Julius Caesar.
Well, the funny thing is, like, when I first read it at first glance, I think it's like, okay, we're currently on 6.
Right.
But it's like, well, hey, we generally agree that Revelation was written later.
Right.
Or during the time of Domitian or whatever it was, so right. That one's tough for me to believe.
So a second theory, and I won't do too many, but the second theory is starting at Augustus, which is the person reigning after Julius Caesar. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 5, you end up at Nero. So instead of number 6, you end up 5 at Nero. So 5 have come and gone. So that could be insinuating that like the resurrection motif is actually hinting at Nero because they've heard that he's died. And then you either decide to skip those 3 again, or you count them, which then 6 is Galba, 7 is Otho, 8 is Tullius now, which those 3, a lot of people never heard because again, they were there for a very short time. If you skip 3, number 6, Vespasian, which we're talking about the sestertius, the coin
yeah.
during Vespasian's reign. Number 7, Titus, a huge character in the fall of the Jewish temple. And number 8, Domitian. Domitian comes up.
I feel like we need a button for Domitian. I don't know what it would be, but.
So number 8 being Domitian. So I kind of like that one because it hits Nero and Domitian.
Yep.
A lot of the other theories kind of say, let's start at Gaius because he was the first that claimed deity. Let's start at Nero and then kind of work our way down because then number 7 is Domitian.
And part of too, I threw a little shade on how it's hard to do it in retrospect. How hard would it be to do it in the present?
Yeah.
The one thing that wouldn't be hard to do in the present is you would know who's ruling at the present time. Right. So if you're existing,
you could
part of it, we don't know exactly when Revelation was written. Was it 96? Was it the 60s? When was it? If I'm there and I'm reading it and he says it's the guy now in power, I can just look up and be like, oh, that guy. And so it is a little harder in retrospect because we're not 100% certain how they would have experienced this letter when they received it based on the dating.
The alternate theory. And that was just the main theory of like chronologically. The alternate theory is that in history, Romans believed that there were exactly 7 kings that established the Roman system. So Romulus, Numa, Pompilius, I'm going to butcher these names, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcus, Tarquinius, Priscus, Servius, Tullius.
This seems like a Gladiator or some movie like that. Superbius.
The point being, there are 7 traditional Roman emperors that founded Rome, essentially. And so that could be like just a history lesson of, these are the 7. There's one more coming.
If that's the interpretation, it's like, hey, it's a call back to the founding fathers as a reminder that, like, again, wink, wink, I'm talking about Rome and the Roman Empire, right? The 7, so in our American context, it's like, is he talking about the current president, the one after it? Or is he saying, no, it's Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, right? Sorry, I think I missed Adams the first time.
No, it's okay. This has been fun, but we got to move on from the game show. I think the only other thing is like a lot of these people that we're talking about, they died like violent deaths. It was not pretty.
And Rome, and again, I'll say it again, Rome was a economy, a system that was built on violence. That's where the they believed that the gods would be appeased through violence. That's where the gladiatorial games came from. That's where the military conquest came from. That's where sacrificing children came from. That's where sacrificing even their armies before a battle would come from. There's one Roman story where they believed that they were losing in this battle, and so they sent out these troops. The earth opened, swallowed them, killed them all, and then closed over the top of them, and then the gods were finally full, and then they won the battle again. Right? So violence and bloodshed was the core value of the Roman Empire. That was like its operating system.
Yeah, I'm seeing like assassinations, I'm seeing poison, I'm seeing suicides of all these emperors. So it's just super interesting to think about. And I mean, I know I've been personally struck with just how closely related Nero and Domitian are. You know, like it feels like Nero was very central to this idea, and like Domitian is kind of carrying that out. And I think it's like goes to the timeless piece of it, where it's like these are the patterns that have been seen even within the Roman history, and you can kind of allude to some of these patterns even today, like we did on Sunday. So that is the game show portion.
Yeah, wow.
We needed a new portion.
There's no quiz on any of that, but just a show how this maps onto real life. Because that's part of it. When you try to interpret the scriptures, you're asking, how would that map onto life in that century? And then is it only meant to apply in that century? Or is it supposed to be a timeless truth that we can apply in our century? And so that's what we've been trying to do.
Which goes back to apocalyptic imagery again, where it's like, hey, you're going to hear something that would have made sense in the first century. And yet it's like this timeless language that gets translated and transposed onto events throughout all of history, that every generation can be wrestling with this same exact question and see a lot of these same patterns, which is really significant, because if you think about what we're seeing, even in this static image that we're looking at, it feels like, yeah, this is the power that has been animating not only the Roman Empire, but it just continues to animate these powers. And so we'll continue because the description's not over yet. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. More kings. Here we go. But who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Pastor Danny, whenever I've heard this passage, I've heard a lot of one world global systems coming together, these 10 kings passing their authority over to the beast, like essentially bowing down to the beast. Is there any veracity to that interpretation? Like, what exactly is going on with these 10 kings in association with this beast?
Yeah, it's funny. I've heard that too. I had not thought about that at all when we were just walking through it, because my mind is in the Roman context, and I was thinking more of when the consolidation of power happened in Rome in a few centuries later, when instead of having all of these different rulers, they decided there's going to be one emperor, or maybe someone decided I'm going to be the one emperor and the rest of you are going to serve me. So maybe that's globalization. We see a little bit of that globalization imagery in the last chapter when the seventh, I think, or the sixth, the bowl is poured out and it dries up the Euphrates. And it seems like it kind of removes these global borders. And when the borders are removed, the kings of the earth start converging on the Valley of Armageddon for a final battle. And so, that doesn't necessarily sound like one world currency, one world empire. It sounds a little more like, hey, we're all going to, but symbolically, everyone's going to start fighting to be the one leader over everything. I mean, it feels to me less like classic globalization and more like superpowers colliding. To say, you think about the British Empire expanding, or you think the Roman Empire expanding, or the Mongolian Empire expanding, or Napoleon expanding. Like if there are multiple world powers and they all come for a final battle because one of us is going to rule the entire earth. In a Roman context, that's Rome that rules the whole quote unquote earth, right? The earth as they knew it. In today's context, that hasn't happened yet. We've had major leaders in the history of the world in these major empires that have existed and expanded. But there's never been a season, as far as I know, in the history of the world where one superpower reigns supreme over all the other nations. So, I don't feel like, nothing in that makes me feel like, oh, it's really just like the world without borders, kind of hippiness kind of thing.
Yeah, and I love that imagery of one world power, because really in the Roman Empire, that's like the known world of the time, and it was really them, and they had there's this kind of conversation about 10 kings subordinate to the beast, cohering with these informal political institutions, kind of what we've been talking about, like how from the seat of power is Rome, and then they kind of set up like mini stations for themselves to rule their entire kingdom, essentially. And so you have these 10 kings that are given authority. So I don't know.
Yeah, and when we look at it from our vantage point, we look at this globe and we're like, we're just talking about like this Mediterranean region.
Right.
But when we're looking at it from the vantage point of the people of that day, Rome was the world. So like Acts 1:8, it's like, go preach the gospel to the ends of the earth.
Right.
And then Judea, Jerusalem, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. He's not talking about South America and China and North America or Canada or Antarctica. He's talking about getting the gospel all the way through the Roman Empire. That was the known earth for them at that time. And so when you read the book of Acts, that's exactly what it does. The end of Acts is this struggle. Will the gospel get all the way to Rome, all the way to the heart of the empire? Right. And kind of the Roman Empire is seen as the entire earth. And so in that analogy, right, these 10 kings are all sharing rulership over the Roman Empire, but there will come a day where it's one united Roman Empire with one emperor reigning over all the others, and not, right, these kind of these different families or these different emperors ruling over different regions.
We'll go look at a map right now, because I think it makes it more prominent when you think Paul really wanted to go to Spain. Like he wanted to go to Rome so that he could eventually travel to Spain. If you look at the map, Spain is like the outer reaches of the Roman Empire and pretty much the gateway to the Mediterranean. So just a little tidbit for you. But to conclude chapter 17 here, the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purposes by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. And then finally, at the end of chapter 17, we get the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So we start with this image of the woman. We finish with the description of the woman and everything in between. So this one, we have the waters, we have the beast, and we have the woman. So round us out. What do you think we're supposed to make of this image that we're sort of seeing for the first time being unveiled to us at the end of the 7 bowls?
Yeah, I do. I was just thinking about what it would have been like in those days to go to Rome. And I mean, you can go to Rome today and it's a huge city, but you can go into the ancient aspects of Rome, and they've excavated a lot of these places and tried to restore a lot of these buildings. You can go and visit the steps where Caesar was assassinated. And even today, by today's architectural standards, you're walking around those ancient marketplaces and the ancient places of worship and the ancient steps of the places where people would go to court and all that. And it's breathtakingly huge. Just everything is so big. And it just reminds me of a scene in any movie where somebody goes to the city for the first time and they're looking around and they're thinking, oh my goodness, what is this place? Right? Yeah. We've talked about some of the big buildings and the big statues that would exist in these places. And so there is kind of like you take this coin and pervert it and be like, oh my gosh, it's disgusting. We take the breathtakingness of this big city. It's like, this is the hub. This is the hive. This is where all the grossness comes out of. And there's a mystery that comes with cities. You know, I think about, I stand, if you go down to Alameda to the naval base there, you can go, field work, brewing's right there. And there's this patio and you can kind of look over, or by the, was it USS Hornet right there? You can kind of look over and see San Francisco. And from a distance, the city has this like mystery around it. Like I always see it in the first word that pops in my head is Nineveh, right? Maybe now it's going to be Babylon, this, like there's this city filled with people who don't know God, and it's huge, and the buildings are huge, and it looks big even though it's so far away, and I can't even swim there, but it feels like it's right there. And so there's this mystery around Rome. And so this unmasking idea is almost like, this taking this mystery and debunking it. Right? That's why I think a lot too of the Wizard of Oz this week, where we're going to the Emerald City. We're going to go visit the great, the powerful, the terrible Wizard of Oz. And he's going to grant us everything. And then you get there and you realize he's nothing. He's powerless, right? There's just a man behind this curtain. Here is the opposite. We get to the heart of the beast. We unveil it and we realize, oh my gosh, it's not just a gorgeous city with great architecture and great food. There's some disgusting demonic power at work that's outputting all this disgustingness into the world. This is the source of everything gross.
Yeah, I think what you said about like the mystery of the city, I think that gets played out throughout the scriptures too, because you'll find that a lot of these references in here are passages in Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, which is coming up next, that if they're not describing Israel for their prostitution, they're going after other gods. It's describing cities like Tyre that were like beautiful in nature and big trade route cities. And a lot of the same destruction language is used of Tyre, thinking Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 37:38, another couple cities there that pull the same strings. And it's like these massive cities somehow or some way, they start turning. I don't know what it is. And I think that description of not knowing exactly what's going on and like what is happening in these cities, like looking across to San Francisco, it's like, man, how did it turn on its head so quickly to think that some of the things that the Bible calls good are actually evil and evil is actually good? It's this animating power. Like, I think that puts a lot of meat on like what I'm feeling in terms of why is all this happening, you know?
Well, and in the ancient world, especially in the Roman world, the cities were the heart of religious worship. That's where, you go to Corinth and it's a major city, and up on the hill, the Acro-Corinth, that's where the temple prostitution took place. You go to Athens, a major city in the ancient Roman world, and up the Acropolis, that's where all these temples of worship were.
Right.
The word pagan that we use a lot today, pagan was a word back in those days that described people who lived in the rural areas. They were kind of outside of the religious heart of the city, and now they're pagans. They live outside, out in these rural areas. They're not religious people. Christians were called atheists in those days because they didn't worship the gods of the empire. And so not just were these cities the center of trade and the centers of commerce, the centers of beauty and architecture, they were also the centers of religious life for the empire. And so now we're really kind of seeing who is the God that is being worshipped in these cities, whether they're worshiping progress, luxury, decadence. Movie I'm thinking about now is Hunger Games, right? They go to the city and it's like, it's decadent, it's luxurious, but it's icky. It's the same kind of thing.
You are on a roll.
I'm on a movie roll, which if you know me, I'm not good at movie references. So I'm also dating myself with all these movies.
Yeah. And I think if you look back to some of the letters of the church again, you see like the one that was associated with Jezebel. I'm not exactly sure which one, but like eating flesh here, it's such a picture of just Jezebel's destruction, how the dogs were going to eat her flesh. That was prophesied in 1 Kings. And then finally burn her with fire, which seems pretty strong until you read Leviticus 21. The daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by whoring or be prostituting herself out, profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. So it's right there in the Old Testament. Just kind of the ultimate justice of what we're seeing happen here.
And they've taken this thing that to the Christian, to the Jewish people, is a sin, a terrible sin, and they've turned it into the system of religion that powers the entire world.
Yeah, and gives
so
birth
just the opposition between God's people and the religious system He's created for them. Right, the temple, according to Jesus, lives in the hearts of the people. We are His body. This network of people expands throughout the entire earth like a wheat field. Very different than these temples, these edifices, and these city areas that are promulgating paganness as we see it, but false religion into the world.
So we go from static description of this image with the woman, with the hills, with the beast, with the horns, all these different things. And then we get to like chapter 18, which we were talking off air. It's kind of confusing, but it gets into like almost songs all of a sudden. And
one of the ways that I understand it, I don't know if this is correct, but I almost feel like chapter 17, if you said like, hey, this is the image that they're writing about in chapter 17.
Yeah. Chapter
18 almost feels like, and here's kind of our response to it, right? It's almost this is what we see, and then this is how we feel, and we're going to express that in song. That's how I understand and experience chapter 18.
And if it is artwork, it's like, here's this artwork. Now let's produce our own. So maybe that's why it's in the form of
here's
art
a
or
painting,
something like that.
here's a song, right? It's a whole like little interactive experience.
So if you're an artist out there, you're probably like, yes, I finally understand. But we'll go right to chapter 18. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. With a mighty voice, he shouted, and here comes the indentation of the scriptures if you have the Bible in front of you. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. I don't know about this, but I see like a pattern of three things. So you probably heard that word haunt, and we see a haunt, every impure spirit, every unclean bird, every unclean and detestable animal. And then we see three things of adultery. So maddening wine of her adulteries, kings of the earth committing adultery, merchants of the earth growing rich from her excessive luxuries. Talk to us about just this foundational, this maybe not foundational, but first, this kickoff verse of this song of fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great.
Yeah, it feels like a song of rejoicing at first. This idea that like, as we experience it, like, yes, right, it's destroyed. As we keep reading, we see there's a little more of lament from the point of view of the people who loved Babylon the Great. So maybe there's some of that here, and maybe that's even the intended purpose here. But we are celebrating, or we're lamenting, that Babylon has fallen, and then we get a description of all that is bad within it. And it's interesting, right? We have a tension between the decadence and the splendor and the majesty of that city, and the grossness and the sinfulness that existed therein. And it reminds me of a couple things. It reminds me of you create this giant building and then it gets infested with termites and the whole thing is going to come collapsing to the ground, that kind of thing. It also reminds me, like we talked about on Sunday, of just the way that the enemy likes to infiltrate these systems of the world and bring grossness into them. And as you were reading that passage, I was thinking about just different systems in our own world that we love and we worship, so to speak, and whether it's like celebrity status or politics or all these different places, right, or athletes. And then you hear of all this grossness that exists in the midst of those cultures. You hear this, right? Watching the news, you hear about these Diddy parties that have been happening right in Hollywood. And it's like, oh my gosh, this happens among like Hollywood elite. And, or we hear about Epstein Island a couple years ago. And like this disgusting stuff happens among politicians and celebrities. Like as the splendor of the world and its money and its wealth grows bigger and bigger, it's almost like deep in its core, there's all these disgusting pockets of things, right? And so I'm sure there are amazing people in Hollywood. I'm sure there's amazing people in politics. There's amazing people in sports. But it does seem like there's this correlation that like the more luxurious and splendiferous or whatever, right? These different systems and edifices are, the more corrupt they can become at levels that, right, even in today's standard, these things are disgusting, gross, and abominable. And so there seems to be a pattern there of just these, how hard the mighty fall kind of thing. I was thinking about that while you're reading it.
A couple passages for our research department out there, if you're interested. We've been talking a lot about the prophets and all the different themes of the prophets that come out in these passages. The one we haven't really talked about that much is Jeremiah.
Which is big on the Babylon theme.
Big on the Babylon theme. I mean, primarily focused on the Babylon theme. And so if you're interested in a lot of connections, I would encourage you to flip to Jeremiah 50 to 51, because I have another chart here. And there's so many different connections to Jeremiah 50, 51 that is prophesying the fall of Babylon. And so it's almost in Jeremiah's time, he's literally prophesying the fall of ancient Babylon, which I think existed, the fall happened 500 BC or so. And now this same motif, again, the motif of the cities, right? Even with Babylon, the name Babylon could refer back to the Tower of Babel, right? Where they're building up this tower, they're building the city. And so it's a theme that just keeps carrying throughout.
It's so funny to map, if we map the Babylonian experience for the exiles in the Old Testament with what we're experiencing in Revelation, it's pretty fascinating, right? Babylon, the people, because of their sin, were captured and brought into Babylon. But as they're going into Babylon, this is the famous like Jeremiah 29, I know the plans I have for you kind of thing.
Right.
God's going to continue to help them thrive even in the midst of Babylon. Jeremiah, was it 39, is where he talks about, hey, as you go into Babylon, you're going to be there a while.
Right.
Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city, have your children there, plant your vineyards there, dig your wells there.
Yep.
And it's almost the opposite of Deuteronomy, where it's like, hey, when you get into the promised land, you're going to enjoy fruit of stuff you didn't create. In Babylon, it's like, you're going to have to create your own fruit there. So go in there and hunker down and make the best of it. And hey, maybe you can redeem the city from within. But then, like you mentioned, they're in there for 70 years. It's 525, I think, AD or BC, when the Edict of Cyrus decree, and they're started to release and go back to build their temple, go back to Israel, go back to Jerusalem, and then Babylon falls behind them. And so now we look at Revelation, where it's like we've been living in modern day Babylon, right? We're living in the midst of the Roman Empire, and then we have this picture that God is going to come and extract. Right? There's this edict from Jesus that he's going to start extracting the believers and take them up to their heavenly home, and then at some point, right, once all the believers are out, boom, the thing's going to come crashing down, and then God's going to rebuild a new city with new walls and with actual no temple, but because the presence of God is with him all the time. And so it's almost like the entire book of Revelation, even though we haven't talked about Jeremiah yet, parallels the Babylonian captivity, the fall of Babylon, and then the creation of the second temple on the other side.
Yeah, I know a lot of us are looking for those Old Testament key-ins. And so Jeremiah 51, I mean, I'm looking at verse 37, Babylon shall become a heap of ruins, the haunt of jackals. That same word haunt there shows up, a horror and a hissing without inhabitant.
Can I give you just one more movie reference?
Go for it.
Haunt of jackals. It's got to be Lion King. That's all.
It's got to be what?
Lion King. I'm thinking like the elephant graveyard, whatever. So that one's just small.
We are on a roll. I love it. Verse 4, we get another voice from heaven, and it says this: come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she has done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day, her plagues will overtake her. Death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. My temptation is to ask, what movie reference do you have there? But how does that song hit you? What are some of the themes that you see playing out right here?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I thought of was the book of Leviticus that talks, I think it's Leviticus, it's quoted in the New Testament of come out, this is King James, I think, but come out from the unclean thing and be separate. This call to come out of her. And, or like a call like from Jesus to a demon possessed person, come out of her. But it almost feels like this call to God's people to come out of Babylon, or maybe it's a call to the demon to come out of Babylon. That might actually make more sense now that I say it. But and then this idea that the whole thing's going to come crashing down, right? And so if it's a call to God's people to come out, obviously you can't leave the Roman Empire, but maybe there's a warning to not, like in Leviticus, be unequally yoked, like in Corinthians, with the systems of this world. And if it's a call to the demon, like come out, is an exorcism, because the whole thing's going to come crashing down. It's that picture of like, get the demon out. The demon's going to be thrown into the lake of fire. The world's going to be destroyed. And then God's going to build a new city. And he's going to invite his people into it because now they're safe. So I'm thinking about all that kind of destruction motif. I'm wondering if there's a literal day that it's destroyed, or what he means by one day.
I mean, that phrase has come up a couple of times now, in 1 hour, in one moment, in one day. It feels like this is the quickness of it. So maybe we're like refocusing in on that bowl story of just how quick it all happens.
Because before it's right, time
drawn
times
out.
And half a time. It's drawn out. There's, you see this, it's just the beginning of the birth pains, and now it's boom, 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 boom. But at the same time, right, when there's silence in heaven for 30 minutes, it's like, that's supposed to feel like a long time, right? And you do the math of a day is like 1,000 years in the Lord. What is that? 20 years is 30 minutes. Right? One day would be a generation, 40 years. And so, we don't really know. It is quick in the grand scheme of things, but we don't know how long quick is when we look at the scriptures.
Yeah, a lot of people have pointed out the same thing of like, well, if you're calling people out of this Babylon, people couldn't necessarily escape Rome, but they could escape from associating with her. So I think it goes back to that prostitution motif, because, even Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:17 talks about coming out from them and being separate from them. So there's a big illusion there. My question to you, we've learned a lot about eye for eye, tooth for tooth in the Sermon on the Mount, this lex talionis concept. And yet we see here, we're getting double portion paid back.
I know.
So what do you think of that? Double portion.
Like the punishment must fit the crime, and now it's double portion.
Yeah. Give her back as she is given. Pay her back double for what she has done. What do you think about paying back double here?
I mean, I was thinking of the tides have turned on the earth, right? And so lex talionis was a way for humans to broker judgment, so you're not lavishing on wrath beyond what's appropriate. Right. That's the same idea in our constitution of the punishment must fit the crime. And yet we see when Jesus talks about forgiveness, he talks about the opposite. Just, whatever you give is going to be given back to you, or judgment. Whatever you give is going to be given back to you. It's going to pour over, that kind of thing. So this idea of, hey, love your enemies, forgive them, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. And this is kind of his way of relating to one another, kind of in kind of social relationships and all of that. But now we're on the other side of history where like justice is coming. And so God is, these people and us deserve the wrath of God. And it feels like if God is saying it's going to run over, this cup of judgment is going to run all, you're going to get double what you deserve. I don't think God is trying to say like, I'm going to go unjust with how much punishment you get. I think he's trying to say, hey, this long suffering season is over. You saying, you know what? I'll commit the crime, then I'll pay the price, then I'll go back to my evil deeds again. It's over. Like we talked about last week. Real epic judgment is coming, and there's no coming back.
And I love the imagery at the very end too, this pestilence, famine, death, mourning. It's somebody going in, and it's like a prolonged siege, and like the fire act at the very end is the final act of destruction, of conquering. And so it does feel very final in nature, just another way of artistically recapitulating this final act of justice. And so verse 9 continues, it says, when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury that we read about in chapter 17, they see the smoke of her burning. They will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour, your doom has come. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. And then we get this really long list of goods. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stone, and pearls. Fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood, and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cargoes of cinnamon, spice, of incense, myrrh, frankincense, of wine, olive oil, of fine flour, and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. So we'll get to that portion in a moment, but let's first talk about the kings of the earth that see the smoke of her burning. They're standing off and they say, woe, woe to you, great city. In 1 hour, your doom has come. Just a continuation of chapter 17 going on here, or what do you think of the imagery here of the kings of the earth who committed adultery?
Yeah, it reminds me of not a movie. It reminds me of, unless it was made into a movie, maybe a VeggieTale, but it reminds me of Jonah chapter 4. So like in Jonah 4, he goes and preaches this message, yet, 30 days? And Nineveh will be overturned. He preaches this message of judgment. And then he goes up on the hill and he's like just wanting God to rain down fire on the city, right? And so it's like just kind of waiting to see the smoke rising and the meteors crashing, but it doesn't come. Instead, they repent, they turn to God, he lavishes forgiveness, and then Jonah's up there like, what? Like, I wanted justice for this place, right? And so I think for us, on one hand, what we're seeing here is a theme that we've seen throughout Revelation, which is, if you're wondering why God isn't bringing his normal clemency when the people repent, it's because they don't. They're too far gone, like we talked about last week. On the other hand, it's almost a reversal of Jonah, that like, hey, if you feel like God needs to bring judgment on the world and its evil systems, he will. And here's where it's happening, right? And so for any of us who've ever felt like Jonah and said, God, why is it that you seem to always forgive? Why is it that you're always so nice? Why is it you always give people second chances? And God says, hey, I'm long suffering, but trust me, those who deserve punishment will receive punishment. Those who receive wrath will receive wrath. This is where all of that is fulfilled. And now it's not God's people out there reveling and like, yay, destruction. They're in heaven. But it's the kings of the earth who are like devastated, saying like, we banked our whole lives on this thing and it's up in flames. And so, yeah, it kind of feels like the perfect justice to all of those stories of this is final judgment. This isn't going to be a story of God's gospel forgiveness for this city. This is the judgment that we've been waiting for. I think Sodom and Gomorrah is a story in the Old Testament where, Abraham is pleading that God would save the city. And he's like, if I can find one righteous person, right? It's kind of the idea by the end of it, that the city can be spared for the sake of the righteous. But God says, but there are none righteous in that city. So I'm going to extract Lot and his family, the righteous ones, and then I'm going to bring judgment on it. And so in Revelation as a whole, we've seen God has extracted his righteous ones, and now he's bringing judgment on the city of Nineveh, or the city of Babylon.
Yeah, I know this is a big hurdle for a lot of people because some people in our context will say, man, it's really hard for me to worship a God that is just in this type of way, where it seems like, man, this is bringing on a lot of things. Even throughout the book of Revelation, you might be thinking like, this just feels like overkill in a lot of ways. And yet, we talk about like people that have experienced just the worst of tragedies, especially overseas, and seen people, family members killed. And all of a sudden they're like, I can't imagine a God that doesn't distribute justice. So what would you say to somebody that's like really struggling with God of justice and wrath?
Yeah, it's funny. I think the closer you are to pain, the more you understand justice. And the farther removed you are from the pain, the more you understand justice.
Which would kind of apply to being married to the city and the prosperous and the wealth, do you think?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking if it's like if I've talked to people in our church in the midst of this series who the thing that is hitting them the most is every time this theme comes up of how long, O Lord, until you finally bring justice to the earth, because they're carrying some heavy things that have happened to people in their family, that have happened to themselves, that have happened to friends of theirs, where it's like, why is God not judging the wicked? Why do these people get off? Right? If you watch, you watch these shows, movies, documentaries about people who've murdered so many and they keep getting off and the justice system fails them. It's like, why is God allowing this to continue happening? When will these people be stopped? And so when you're that close to the pain, a lot of times God's justice makes more sense because you've been praying for that justice. I remember watching a TV show about a guy who was just a terrible human being who just kept doing terrible things to women and getting off. And he would go to the police station to be released. His girlfriend would be arrested, right? All these, he was sociopath, psychopath. And then finally by the end of it, it's like he ends up in this police standoff and he kills himself. And watching, my first thought was like, oh, good. Like, I'm so glad he's finally dead, because like if everything we've seen so far, anytime he's not dead, he's like the beast that rises again and does it to another woman. He's destroying lives and families. And it's like the only way to stop him is to kill him. So I think on one hand, when you're really close to a situation like that, you understand justice in a different way. And I think the people in the recipients of this book were a lot closer to seeing their friends and family killed and murdered by the sword. I also think the farther removed you are, the more it makes sense. So I think like, I've never heard someone hear the Sodom and Gomorrah story in the Old Testament and be like, why would God judge those people, right? Or you hear about some of the devastating things happening in the Old Testament and then God rains down judgments. Like, you get it, right? Like, oh my gosh, this is disgusting. Like, these people had to be put out of their misery, so to speak. And we're far removed from it. So it's like, the hard thing about this is we keep picturing our own world, right? Where it's well, I don't want God to rain down fire on this world. Like I'm sure there's gross stuff happening, but it's like, I like it. And I'm in here and it feels unfair. And what about the people? And we're making all these what about those. But it's like when we're thinking about actual people who deserve punishment, we're thinking about actual cities that need judgment in the history. Like no one is like, why did Hitler have to die? Like, why couldn't he been forgiven by God? And then, like when you think of grand examples, it's like, no, that guy couldn't be stopped unless he was killed, right? And so we're glad that the carnage ended when the war ended. He killed himself. And so this feels like one of those final big giant things of like, this system needs to be stopped. The only way it can be stopped is with the sword and the sword of God's wrath. And so when we look at it through that angle, it's a little easier to understand. Or when we look at contexts where we are okay with justice or judgment or death, we understand. This is supposed to be like one of those cases. This is not like a bunch of nice people who were trying their best, but they made some weird decisions and now God is pouring down wrath on them. This is like God has removed his people from a city that's beyond hope, and now he's going to bring the flood waters because everyone that he loves is in an ark and they'll be safe, but the world needs to be recreated.
Right. Yeah. And it's pretty fascinating to see that their reaction is standing far off, like they've disassociated with themselves, and then they're crying out like, how did this happen? In 1 hour, your doom has come. So we get this odd transition in verse 11, and you probably heard it when we read the passage, but it transitions to the merchants of the earth. And then we get this long list of 28 different goods. I won't ask about every single one or else we'll be here all day again. But what I do want to ask, I do want to point out a couple things. If you look at all of these different types of goods, you'll find that just the trade route of the Roman Empire was just so vast. I mean, all these different goods are coming from all over the place. They're basically financing and establishing their luxurious life. They're building tables out of these. They're building necklaces, clothing, all these different things, and a lot of it is on the backs of manipulation, of even slave labor here. So I wanted to point out all of these goods here that get described here. Why transition to the merchants in particular, and what stands out to you as you were studying this about the list of different goods here?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's supposed to be a very complete list.
Right.
And I think it's a bit of a sobering reminder that if the evil systems of the world fall, many of us are sad because we benefit from the splendor.
Right.
Right. So like, I'm not saying these merchants are evil, but they're sad because they've been benefiting from Rome, even though it's been an evil system. You know, and it makes me think of just times in our country, and this is not the same necessarily, but I think of like 2008. It's like everyone's so excited about the .com boom, and then all of a sudden the bubble bursts, and then boom, the whole economy crashes. And it's like, we realize like, man, we were benefiting from this system for so long, you know, and we can continue to benefit as we push our money into the market or whatever. I think about when the housing bubble, the housing crisis happened, and it's like, man, people got too greedy. People were like, you know, doing some unethical stuff that didn't make logical sense, couldn't scale with lending and with securities. And then the whole thing blows up, and like it's like, man, like they really messed up, but then we're kind of sad because we benefit from that system. Like, man, I was able to buy a house and put no down, and I had no job, but I lived in this great house. And it's like, it makes sense that, you know, when I literally did that, I bought a house with a, you know, one of those bad mortgages. I didn't know that all of that stuff, this is all of us back in like 2004 or whatever. But when it crashes, like, yeah, I kind of figured it would, cause this didn't even make logical sense, but it's like, I'm sad cause I liked being able to buy a house, you know?
Yeah,
and so
there's
a little bit of this like juxtaposition between, and this is a good thing. Of course this happened, but we benefited from this. And I think it might be a bit of a warning to us that like it says, do not love the world or anything in the world. Right? Do not love the world means don't love this system where God does not reign, and be careful about the things you fall in love with in the world, because when you benefit from this system, you're going to be devastated when the system crashes. And like with the slave labor thing, you might even be like culpable to, right? You're wearing these sweatshop clothes. Wait, you are, you know, buying houses that are built by slave labor, whatever it is in whatever context. Like, in order to like take advantage of things that are quote unquote like normal, fine in any society, if the society is corrupt, like this one was, and many are because of Satan, they're all of them probably at some level, we all are complicit in this system. And so we should be aware of that before it falls, so that we can have the right relationship with our love for the world, to love it like God does, with a redemptive love, not a participatory love.
Yeah. I'm just so fascinated by the economic conversation in the first place. It's infused into Revelation, because you've seen it from the very beginning, from the seals, the economic challenges, reserve the oil and the wine. You've seen just a lot of the mark of the beast being a part of the economy. And now we have the economy here, like being tethered to the economy. And I tell you, like every time I look at this list, it is vast. I mean, it is incredible the amount of trade happening from different places, like the metals from Spain, or if you remember in history class, again, you get silk from like the China area, you get these ivory products from Northern Africa, you get all these different products from, spices from India, all these different places producing these grains. And just like, this is a massive system, and it's almost impossible not to participate in it. And yet the challenge is not to love it. And I can imagine, again, going back to the trade guilds of like, it's questioning their loyalty of, do I participate in this trade guild if it's going to make me participate in pagan worship? I think that's such a powerful question, and maybe one that hopefully Revelation brings to the forefront of our minds as even we're leaving this series, or getting ready to leave it, I guess.
I just can't help but think about this last week with our presidential election and the kind of platforms of these candidates. And, we see every state in the union voted more conservative and more Republican than they did in the last election, like a huge shift. Every 50 of 50 states became more red. And the platform of Donald Trump as he ran was this idea of like, we want to make this country great through securing our borders, bringing jobs back to America, becoming a superpower, creating some of the goods that can, we're exporting stuff, not importing stuff. We're providing our own oil, and we're going to create a robust economy. We want to create a place where people can have jobs, people can buy houses, right? And this is a message that resonates with people, because this is what a good city is supposed to do, is provide all of these things. And so something in us is like, I want to live in a safe place. I want to live in a place where there's economic freedom. I want to be able to support my family, buy a house, whatever those things are. I want our country to be one that exports and brings good into the world more than we have to rely on these foreign things, right? Those are all things that are natural to the human experience. This is why it resonates with Christians, non-Christians, right? People of like men, women, all nationalities are all voting more for this candidate, because something about this platform resonates with their hearts. There's something ingrained in us that wants safety, security, and that's what we actually see in the heavenly kingdom in the next couple chapters. This is a place where there's no crime, where we're all fed, where the trees feed the nations and bring healing. And it's like this beautiful city where we're all provided for. There's something in us that longs for what that platform was promising, that longs for what these merchants were longing for. And I think there's a bit of a warning in that like, hey, it's not a bad thing to long for. That is what God ultimately provides.
Right.
But be careful about how you connect and fall in love with things in this world, because this world is not your home, because there's sinful ways to get it and there's good ways to get it. And just because it brings you riches does not mean you should, right? There's 1,000 stories. All of us can tell about that. And so just don't merely seek after these things like the kings of the earth did and prostituted themselves with this woman in the wilderness, but seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added to you as well. And so I think I think in every election you see where there's a kind of a massive turn. I think of Obama running on hope, Trump running on the economy around, right, America being great. There's something that resonates with the heart of people that they kind of strike the right chord, and it was like, whatever that is, I want that. And there's a warning in scripture of, hey, these are good things. Hope obviously is a biblical concept. Security is a biblical concept. And yet we need to just make sure that we're seeking first God and his kingdom and trusting that these things are byproducts of God's kingdom, because these people sought first the wares of that city, but the byproducts were the blood of the martyrs. The byproducts was violence. The byproducts was slavery. They did it in the wrong way.
Wow. Yeah. Such a refreshing warning. And even, how do you work that through in your mind? And I think that takes a lifetime of checking your heart constantly. And so we'll continue on here because we're almost to the end of the chapter. Verse 14, they will say, presumably the people looking on, seeing the smoke of the city burning, the fruit you longed for is gone from you. All your luxury and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, just like the kings of the earth, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. In 1 hour, such great wealth has been brought to ruin. It seems like things are starting to repeat here. Instead of the kings saying this, we have the merchants who sold their grain and wealth saying pretty much the same thing, but actually describing the beast. So dressed in fine linen, or the woman sitting on the beast, dressed in fine linen, purple scarlet, glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. It's very similar language here. I love this one line, all your luxury and splendor. In the Greek, it's all your lipara and lampra. So it's like, I think one translation had it, all the glitter and glamour, trying to capture that alliteration. But what do you say to these people that are saying, you've lost your glitter and glamour here, oh city, oh great city?
I mean, the phrase that sticks out to me is what we were just talking about, like all these things you've sought after or longed for.
Right.
And there's this warning that's kind of the core to the message of Jesus, right? Like we just mentioned, you seek first the kingdom of God. These things will be added to you, all the glitter and glamour, the streets of gold in the heavenly kingdom. But these people who sought the earthly things, they get nothing. They're receiving the wrath of God in the bull's judgment. Everything they worked for is burned up and gone. And even when we see the judgment of believers in the scriptures, right, the Bema seat judgment, that's in Corinthians, right, that we're going to stand before God and our work will be judged. And the stuff that is eternal, all the gold, precious stones, it's going to stand the refiner's fire, and we take it with us, in a sense, into the kingdom. All that doesn't matter, the wood, hay, stubble, is just burned off like dross, like the wheat and the tares, it disappears. And so there's this warning here of, man, we went after all the glitz and glamour of this world, and we couldn't take it with us, right? It burned up right here, and now we got nothing. Yeah. Where these other people who've been praising God throughout this book, they sought after Jesus and Jesus alone, even though it cost them even their lives. And they end up inheriting, like what Jesus is, that much and more in eternal life. And so I think it's just a real jarring embodiment of Jesus' teachings on seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added unto you as well. Yeah.
And I think so often we find safety in these things, right? And I think the jarring phrase in all of this is in 1 hour. In 1 hour, like the snap of a finger, it's gone. Like, I think of Jesus' teaching of like, store up your treasures in heaven where vermin and moth cannot destroy, and thinking about like how temporary these things are. And yet we look to them for safety. We think it's going to last a long time. And yet in 1 hour,
and it works both ways, right? In 1 hour, those things, you're in a massive flood, earthquake, whatever, fire, 1 hour, it's gone.
Right.
Jesus also teaches the opposite side, where it's like, you fool, tonight your very life will be demanded of you. Then what are you going to show for all your labor, right? You build bigger barns, you set yourself up for life, but you're dead. You don't have a life. So, your life can be taken away in a single hour as well.
Man, well, it gets a third one. We get a third little woe going on here, which matches the eagle, the messenger. It has 3 woes. Every sea captain. Interesting turn here. We get to look at the sea and seeing people sailing their ships. All who travel by ship, the sailors, and all who earn their living from the sea will stand far off once again. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin. So why the zoom here on sea captains out of all people? So we've seen the kings of the earth, we've seen the merchants, and now we're seeing these sea captains. And yeah, what do you make of these 3 woes in a row?
Yeah, part of it is there's a parallelism with all of Revelation, right? Where we saw this in the seals, the trumpets, the bowls. We see it all over the place. Where there's a plague that strikes the sea, then there's a plague, or it strikes the land, then it strikes the sea, then it strikes the fresh water, then it strikes the throne of the beast, and the kings of the earth, right? And so over and over again, we see God is dismantling the land, the sea, the kings, the land, the sea, the kings, the land, the sea, the kings. So here we have it again, right? We have this a complete woe from these merchants on land, from the seafarers on the sea, from the kings of the earth. I think that's part of it. I think when I'm reading it, I was thinking, man, if this was a movie, it could end with these guys being really sad. It could also end with this, like, man, this sucks. We love this city. It did so much for us. It was so great. And then they kind of look at each other and they're like, well, you guys want to go to lunch? Right? It's like, because, it just feels like them being far off from it. On one hand, it's like they're not in it, they're watching it, they benefited from it.
Right.
But then it's almost like you get, and I don't think this is what the intention is in Revelation. I was just thinking this, but it's almost like the hypnosis is over and you're like, what are we going to do now? Like if I was writing like an indie film about this, that's what would happen next is the guys would look at each other and be like, you guys want to get a pizza or something? Right. And then they go back and, at the beginning of the movie, they were eating pizza, playing cards and hanging out with their friends. And then they got sucked into this den of lies and iniquity. And then the whole thing burns down. And at the end of the movie, they're just eating pizza, playing cards and being friends. It's like the hypnosis is over because the city is destroyed. I don't see the hypnosis over here, but that's what I just keep thinking is then they've been hypnotized by this thing. And now they're just standing there watching it burn. It's like, man, we built our whole life around this thing.
Yeah.
I mean, these people the kings ruled it. The merchants bought and sold from it. The sea vessels brought stuff to and from it. It's like, this was the center of their lives and now it's gone.
Yeah. I think of the destruction of Tyre again, Ezekiel 27. If you look at some of the destruction language, it talks about the merchants and their merchandise, the mariners, your pilots, all these different people get mentioned in a very similar destruction motif happening in Ezekiel 27. I was also interested in like why sea captains, like why the sea? And so, according to first century writings, the unpredictable and destructive character of the sea meant that seafarers, people who went out in the sea, were fools, attempting to do what was contrary to nature and against the will of the gods, and therefore impious. Every ship was an insult to the sea and a deliberate challenge to the gods. The primary motive for seafaring was thought to be greed. Nature has spread out the sea as a trap for the covetous. Some powerful words from Pliny's history.
The seas, I keep thinking of that one-hit wonder song, Brandy. Right? You're a fine girl. It's like this guy's like, Brandy, you're amazing, but my life, my love, my lady's the sea. Right? The sea calls my name. Right? Yeah. So there's always been this thing about seafarers that it's just like they can't be pinned down.
Well, I think that would be a really good ending to this whole section. You get a peek behind the curtain. You get these couple songs, and then you get these three woes that are very similar from the kings of the earth, from the merchants, and from the seafarers. And yet we get to verse 20, and it's kind of an interesting end. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets. For God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you. And I know we were debating, like, do we continue? Where does this passage break? Does this passage break at right here, or does it keep going to 19 verses 1 through 8? Because in there you'll find three hallelujahs as well. So like three worshipful celebrations, which kind of juxtaposes those triads, because they come from the 24 elders, the 4 living creatures, and the people surrounding the throne. And so, why do you think it's landing right here on rejoicing? We've seen it all. We've seen all this craziness. Why rejoicing at the end?
I think we go back to the beginning of the chapter, the former chapter. John is invited into the wilderness to go take a look at something from his vantage point, but he's watching these people like ants to an anthill, right? Or maybe ants to like a garbage dump or something, come and go from this beast. And it's just like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like, what is this disgusting thing?
So in verse 20 here, we get a little bit of an interesting transition, because instead of the 3 woes that we just saw, we see 3 statements of rejoicing. So in verse 20, it says, rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets. For God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you. So we haven't gotten quite to the end yet, because we have one more song to finish. But why do you think we end these threefold woes with threefold rejoice statements?
Yeah, I think we need to remember that right now we're in the vantage point of the people who experienced the fall. And I don't know if this is all on purpose, but if it is, it's really masterful. So I hope it is. But when we start this story, what we have is John being invited into the wilderness to go kind of look from his vantage point at this prostitute on a beast and these kings coming to her. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And then as the story continues, it's almost like we're invited into the vantage point of the people who are experiencing this thing. And so that by the time that Babylon is falling, we have the sea merchant, all the people who are affected by this system are all crying, and we're in their vantage point. And now this is like the last layer where we zoom back out again to our vantage point and be like, so while they're all lamenting, we are rejoicing because this thing has finally fallen. So it feels to me primarily to be kind of putting a bow on the whole thing and saying, in the same way that they are lamenting, we are rejoicing because this system that's been keeping us down. They've been, we talked about slave labor. They're also like benefiting from the blood of the martyrs. They're using Christians in their gladiatorial games to bring sport to people and all these things. This system that was built on our backs has crashed, and now we're finally free.
Which gets mentioned in this final song that concludes the entire thing. I love how it says rejoice. And then in verse 21, it says, a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, and here's the song, with such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of prophets and of God's holy people, of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. That concludes chapter 18 here. What do you make of this final song when this angel picks up a large millstone, throws it in the sea, talks about all these things that will never be found again in the city of Babylon?
I mean, the millstone is a warning from the teaching of Jesus, right? It says, if any of you cause one of these little ones to stumble, it'd be better off for you to have a large millstone tied around your neck and then thrown into the sea. So this idea of, kind of like think of like the mafia with like concrete boots or cement boots or whatever, right? This idea of tie this giant rock to your neck, throw you in the ocean, you're going to drown. And it's this warning that if you mess with my people, judgment is coming for you. And so, I wonder how much this crying out of God's people throughout this age is, God, you said judgment's coming, that you're going to stop this violence. When are you going to stop this violence? Like, this is a system that every time it's cut down, it comes back up again and it starts hurting us again. And now we see that ultimate judgment that God ties a millstone, not around the neck of a person, but on the entire civilization, right? All of Babylon has a millstone tied around its proverbial neck, and all of Babylon is sunk into the bottom of the sea, and everything drowns in it. The music drowns, the industry drowns, the sinfulness drowns, the judgment drowns, the murder drowns. It all just bubbles down to the bottom of the sea, and now God's people are looking around. It's gone.
And I think it's just such a fitting end, because that's how Jeremiah 51 ends. When you finish reading this book, it says, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates and say, thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster that I'm bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. And that's how the book ends. Wow. And so it's a really cool tie-in to the Old Testament literature, talking about just the banishment of everything that's happening, grinding millstones where they're essentially making bread, all these marriages happening, all of essentially life is just going to be gone. And we see that, hey, by our magic spell, the nations were led astray, almost like you were hiding behind the curtain. Now we see it for what it is. We see that the blood of the prophets, all these ways that you have taken advantage of God's people, and now it's coming back on you. So that's where we're left off, leading into chapter 19 and 20 next week. And it's going to get really good, I think.
Yes, once Babylon is drowned in the depths of the sea, there's some final stuff that has to happen, but we can start to rebuild civilization in the name of Jesus Christ, which is cool.
There we go. So look forward to it. See you next time, Pastor Danny.
See you then.